All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Chase. I am one of the design officers here. And today's game of the week is on Celeste. And I wanted to highlight how Celeste does player empowerment. And we'll kind of talk about what that is and how to kind of do that in our own games. So what is player empowerment anyways? It's empowering the player, but what does that look like in real games? And these are just kind of generalizations, but it could be giving the player mechanical choices, like the ability to mix and match. Path of Exile, Wizard of Legend, Lore Arcana all do this in that they allow you to customize the way that your abilities work. It could also mean giving the player paths or endings. Minecraft is an amazing example because it's just purely what the player wants to do, you know. Or it could be giving the player really tight controls, giving them a lot of making them feel like their character is very strong or fast. Celeste is a game that does this, and that's kind of what we'll be talking about. Warframe and Super Hexagon. They also have that the ability to. It's all about like fast movement and really actiony kind of thrill-based combat type stuff. And so we'll be looking mainly into that third bullet point for this workshop. Any questions or comments before we dive in?
When you say like tight controls, does that mean like that makes you feel like cool?
Tight as in like responsive, like the player does exactly what you want them to when they want you to. There's no delay or sliding or like some games don't necessarily prioritize having immediate response times and control over your player. Have you played Human Fall Flat or seen it? It's a game that centers around the idea that it's really hard to walk or pick things up or do even basic functions. And so in a game like that, you do not have tight control over your player. You have the opposite. You have this, there's a lot of, like you'll find yourself, even when like you turn, you'll accidentally like walk a little bit, and it's like, you don't have as much like immediate control over your player. So that's what I mean by that. Good question. Anything else? All right. I should warn, if you have not yet played the game, I am going to be going through most of it. I will stay away from plot stuff, but I'm going to be covering basically the major mechanics in each area. So you have been warned.
Does that include the major mechanics that were explained in Chapter 9?
I personally have not gotten there. This goes up to Summit.
Okay.
But yeah, I haven't. I went through the main story, and then I went back and got all the strawberries and the crystal hearts and the B-sides.
Yeah.
And so I've done that for everything up to Summit. I haven't done the B-side on Summit. And then I haven't touched Chapter 8 or 9 yet. So the entire game is built off of very basic things. In the first gift to the left here, you can see we can move and we can jump. It's a platformer. That's pretty standard. They don't even teach you how to do that. They just assume that you know what Celeste is, you know it's a platformer, you know how to move left and right and jump. Then they teach you that you can climb. And that's unique to Celeste. That's something that is added on to the basic platformer movement. And then the third thing that the game uses is the ability to dash. and the entire game builds off of just this, which is very elegant, and it provides a lot of room to expand. However, if these things didn't feel good to the player, the rest of it would be worthless. If jumping, if the gravity was off just a little bit and you felt a little too floaty, it wouldn't have nearly the same effect. If climbing didn't feel right, if dashing didn't feel right, it wouldn't get the effect off that Celeste actually aims for. So let's look at the first area in the game, Forsaken City. Here we have, on the left we have a block that when you stand on it, it moves quickly to the end of the kind of pulley. And then on the right we have a crystal that regenerates your dash. So just thinking about these, how can these be used in the game? I'm sure that you guys have played the game already, and so you kind of know, but how would these specific mechanics empower the player, do you think?
The fact that the pulley gives faster motion can get you to places while preserving your dash, while the other one refreshes your dash. In my opinion, they both play off of the fact that you get to reserve your dash through a longer time span.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it doesn't. So we can see here that this pretty much demonstrates exactly what you were saying about the stoplight blocks, and that's it. It launches you across the screen. You jump off and you go flying, and you still have your dash afterwards. And as we learn, as we'll talk about throughout the rest of the kind of workshop, moving fast is really fun. It's a tried and true method of making you feel really cool, especially when there's a challenge that you're overcoming by going fast. And so this is kind of like what the rest of the workshop is going to be building on. Any comments or questions?
I really like how they do the camera shake when something goes, when you jump or something. It gives you more of an effect.
Yeah. Yeah, screen shake definitely adds to the feel. Honestly, that is a form of, at least the perception of empowerment. That these things are happening and they're so powerful that they're shaking the screen, and so even though it doesn't actually mechanically affect how the player interacts with the world, it affects the player's perception of the game. And actually perception, whether the game actually reflects this or not, the player's perception of the game is more what matters. I like to think of Firewatch as an example. Have you guys played that?
Mm-hmm.
Firewatch is a single linear story. There are no multiple paths or multiple endings, except that you get to choose different dialogue options. And the dialogue options that you choose completely affect the player's perception, your perception of who your character is. It doesn't affect the game in any way whatsoever. It's just for the player. And I think that that's a really neat thing to consider, and an important thing to consider when designing games, is that sometimes agency doesn't mean affecting the game, it means the perception that you're affecting the game, if that makes sense. that was a nice tangent. Anything else before we move on?
Firewatch is a book.
So Firewatch is a book?
It's a book.
Just that in that it
plays like a book.
It plays like a book. It plays linearly.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. It wasn't my favorite game, but it was interesting enough, you know. But anyways, moving on. Then we get to the second area, and there's this weird space jelly stuff, you know. And you dash through it. On the way out, it regenerates your dash. You can see that in the second one. And again, it's all about fast movement and making the player feel really good. You know, that's kind of the idea that Celeste capitalizes on in their version of player empowerment. We see in Golden Ridge now. I skipped the hotel because it doesn't really have. It actually kind of does a lot of the opposite. Rather than giving the player fast movement and, you know, big fun abilities, the hotel actually makes the player slow down and really consider and think ahead because of there's a lot of like that weird nightmare goop stuff that will harm you if you touch it, and so I wanted to kind of emphasize more of the empowerment side of things, although if we want to later on we can go back and talk about how the hotel how that fits into the rest of Celeste. But moving on to the fourth area, Golden Ridge, they give you these weird water orb things that essentially act as an additional dash. And as well as they give you clouds that if you time your jump right will launch you very high. We see this theme of fast movement and we see it applied more in a strategic way and in a challenging way, but it's all about fast movement and having immense control over what the player or what the character is doing at any given time. So I think that's kind of a good spot to take a break. Does anyone have any questions or comments on anything that we've talked about so far? Just brief check-in. Cool. So now, taking a break from Celeste for a moment, I want you guys to kind of take a moment to think of a game that you enjoy that you feel does a good job of empowering the player, whether through movement like Celeste does or through other methods like those that I described kind of near the beginning. What specifically about that game makes you feel empowered as a player, and how can we apply that idea to our own game development experiences? Does anyone want to give that a shot? Just starting with the first question. Yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of like Minecraft, but like Terraria does a good job at it too, because like you can like get items to like make you go faster, jump higher, fly, and like I think all of those stuffs with like movement, it like helps the player. Like in the beginning, it's kind of like, oh, I'm like not that strong right now, but like later on, it's like, okay, this feels like a lot better.
Yeah, for sure.
And like items, same thing too.
I think when it comes to Terraria in specific, they give a lot of different options for like what kind of because they have so many different kind of like build paths. You could do like a high mobility type of build path where you have like the double jump, the wings, as well as like the like boots where you can fly, all of that. Or you can go with like the and like with the Hermes boots where you go fast. But sometimes people are like, I don't really care about the movement, and they're like, I really want to do. I'll rely on my like grapple hook, and I'll just like go like full tank or full damage, and they'll deal with it like that. So it's like a lot of different ways that a player can decide whether or not they want to do something or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Terraria offers, like you said, a lot of different build paths, and that kind of ties into that first idea of mechanical choices that the player can make, where they can kind of customize the gameplay experience to how they like to play. And yeah, also something else that Terraria does is that they keep throwing harder versions of the same bosses at you. You know, there's the one floating eye, the one skeleton, and what's the other boss before Helmet?
King Slime, baby.
Eater of Worlds.
Eater of Worlds, that's what I was thinking. They have these
The mech versions.
they have these basic versions of the bosses, and then after you defeat the Wall of Flesh and enter Hell mode, they throw redone, revamped versions of the same bosses at you, that are significantly more difficult, but they still feel like the original ones, and so the player knows these bosses are like the ones I fought before, but they're harder, and I'm still able to beat them. You know, that sense of I've progressed, I've become stronger, and I'm able to handle these more difficult challenges. So yeah, Terraria, another fantastic example of player empowerment. So how can we apply that like what we discussed right then? How can we apply that to our own game development experiences? How can we apply that to our own like design perspectives?
I think like giving players like more choices and like just making them like feel good, make the character feel good.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely giving the player more choices, letting them pick between a variety of options, is definitely one way to empower the player.
I think that when it comes to it, you can't necessarily just give options, because a lot of, in pretty much every game, a lot of the time there's like one pretty much like basic set that you'll go down. I think it's giving multiple viable options. Like it doesn't have to be like a whole like plethora of options. It has to be like a couple of really actually useful ones. Like in Terraria, there's like the different classes, even though like technically if you want to get like the super max highest damage, you'd go with like a ranger. It's like, well, if you don't want to be grinding all the stuff to farm stuff, you have the option of going mage, and then you just rely on your mana, or you have the option of going melee if you want to get up and close, even though all of them technically have like their pros and cons. Even though one of them has like highest DPS, stuff like that, you still have a way of choosing, because all of them are good at something, rather than like just having a ton of options in general.
Right. Obviously, there is this idealized assumption that your game is balanced. But yeah, besides just giving the player choices, making sure that those choices are actually useful and meaningful, and that they are all viable, I guess, that they're balanced against one another. The larger your game becomes, the more difficult this becomes to do, obviously. And so within the scope of the club, it's a little bit more reasonable to kind of expect that, but there's also the downside that you might not actually be able to get a ton of different classes or paths through your game in a 10-week span of time. So obviously all of these concepts that we're discussing are in an ideal state where scope doesn't matter, budget doesn't matter, balance is just assumed, that these are like the ideal things that we would like to shoot for.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Anyone else want to give a shot of going through a game, or Anyone have any other questions or comments? Okay. Then let's move on. Back to Celeste. We've covered blocks that launch you, space jelly, bouncy clouds, and orbs that boost you. What more could Celeste possibly do to make the player feel like a boss? They give you a second dash. What more could you ask for than more of the thing that makes you feel really good? It gives you more control over the screen. It gives you, technically it gives you more paths through the level because there are more, obviously not in this case where there's really only one viable path, but in a lot of the levels, after you acquire the second dash, there are actually a lot of different ways that you can choose to go through them, because you now have this additional movement. And then they take this second dash and they build on all of the previous mechanics that they've implemented to really like set in this feeling that like this is the full potential of the game. You know, this is what everything has been building towards. Now that you have this second dash, and on top of the fact that there's just an amazing soundtrack to go with the summit level, this part in particular just really makes the player feel like they've overcome the mountain, essentially. And this just reinforces the idea that don't be afraid to give the player exactly what they want. A lot of designers, I think, get caught in the idea that, oh, we need to restrict how much the player can do, otherwise they'll just walk over our game and it won't be challenging. We need to provide enough challenge. Celeste does that perfectly. There's plenty of challenge in all of these levels. My death count attests to that fact. But it's still, despite how many times you die on a single level, the game still feels good, and it's still an enjoyable experience that makes you feel strong within the game. That being said, is empowerment necessary? Do we need it? And the answer is not necessarily. Dark Souls. How does Dark Souls empower the player?
Ever so slowly, whenever you beat a boss, it's just when you get over the tribulate wall in front of it, I guess that's empowerment slightly. It makes you feel better.
It makes you feel better, but it doesn't empower you. It gives you catharsis. And that's where the fun lies in Dark Souls. There's this really massive challenge in front of you, and you're gonna die a heck ton of times fighting this boss. But when you finally beat him, that's what makes Dark Souls fun.
I guess on the third or fourth playthrough, there is a ton of empowerment, but that's not really from like getting a singular item or getting a bunch of things that make your character stronger. It's more about you've got the skill of, and you know how all of this stuff works. And so it's like a personal empowerment, but mechanic-wise, there's no internal empowerment of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of empowerment through feeling really strong is just one way, like that fantasy power trip kind of feeling. That's just one way that games could be fun. We have catharsis, like in Dark Souls and in Human Fall Flat, which I referenced earlier. That's the game where even walking is hard, and it's really difficult to pick things up and climb and stuff. when even walking is a challenge, the game centers around this idea that overcoming challenge is where its fun lies, you know. Fun can come from flow, like in Osu or old TV, where you just get into this kind of rhythm state where everything is reactionary and instinctive, and I think that when players get really familiar with a game, a lot of games start to become this flow state where you just glide through it. Like you almost kind of turn off your brain and it's just pure instinct, because you're so you're so I don't know exactly how to put it. Flow's kind of an interesting experience to describe if you don't know what it is. But the idea that you just kind of flow through the game, like it's just another interesting way to do that. Agency, like in Minecraft and Path of Exile, we kind of talked about those. I would put Terraria on there as well. And then narrative. Narrative is another place that fun can come from. Like I said, Firewatch mechanically is not interesting whatsoever. It's the story that is the reason that you play it. Or the Stanley Parable. What about the Stanley Parable empowers the player? What makes you, like, why is the Stanley Parable fun?
The narrator.
The narrator. It's all about the story. It's all about kind of discovering the possible endings, I guess, as well as it also relies a lot on humor, I think. The Stanley Parable could have a very different tone if it was like a darker theme and not as fun, or not as like light. But it would still be fun, even if it was like this darker, kind of more mysterious type game, you know? I believe this is my last slide. And there's a lot to kind of unpack, a lot of rabbit trails to kind of go down. What's our time? Where are we at? It's only 1:30. So we have plenty of time to go into discussion.
Describe agency.
Agency. Agency is the concept of choice, the concept of the player's actions affect the game state, and that can show up in a lot of different ways. But I'll use Minecraft as an example. What makes Minecraft fun? What makes creative mode in Minecraft fun, especially? Why is creative mode any fun whatsoever?
Yeah, like unlimited resources.
Unlimited resources. Yeah, you can, it's the idea that you can do whatever. You can build. You can, I mean, flying for one thing is great. But yeah, you can build, you can, redstone, you can craft these complex systems that do crazy things with the groundwork that the game has already laid. Minecraft creative mode is all about agency, the concept that you're in control, which is definitely an interesting thing to build your game around. I think a lot of sandboxes rely on agency to give you that sense, because there's no challenge, there's no adversity. It's all about exploration and discovery and creation. And I think that's one of the reasons that we even make games in the first place, like we as developers, because we want to create these worlds. We want to take a computer and make something that is fun, make something that is actually a pleasurable experience from essentially nothing. So yeah, these are a lot of the big ways that games find fun. If we want to, we can, pick a game and try and find what aspects about it are fun aside from just empowerment. Look at other paths if we wanted to. Or if we wanted to, we could go in and see how all of these apply to Celeste, since it is Game of the Week Celeste. Where do you guys want to take the rest of this kind of discussion workshop?
I just wanted to note one thing on like Minecraft survival mode.
Yeah.
That is probably why the game is as ubiquitous as it is now, as in comparison to like, there's a ton of games out there that have a roughly equivalent gameplay loop as the Minecraft, the one with the zombies appear. What is that mode called? Survival mode?
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a fairly few number of games that are like a roughly equivalent to that, but there aren't nearly as many that have a creative mode that is quite as many options and quite as enjoyable as Minecraft's creative mode, which is a note on how like people really enjoy adjacency, and it's just like Lego bricks. Why are Legos fun? Because you get to build within the box, or because you get to build within your head?
Yeah, sure. So where do we want to go for the rest of the discussion? Or do we want to just end super early? We got options, we got time.
Did you guys have a workshop last week?
Yeah.
Yeah, Luke led that one last week.
What was that? It was about MDA, which is Mechanics Dynamics Aesthetics, which is a term that gets thrown around in design circles. So mechanics are like the building blocks of your game. Like your character can run, your character can jump, the enemies can move. Those are like simple mechanics. Aesthetic or dynamics are how those mechanics work together. Like your character can run and jump and land on an enemy's head, thus killing it. That'd be a dynamic, a fairly simple one. And aesthetics is how those dynamics work together to provide a feeling for the player. And we talked about that, and I probably hit on a couple other nails, but I don't remember them specifically.
We basically did MDA in this workshop, I just didn't call it that. Going back to the beginning slides, we took a look at the mechanics, and then in each one we talked about the new mechanics that each level added, as well as how those mechanics interact with one another to create dynamics, all building up to the aesthetics specifically for this workshop of empowerment. You can see jumping, dashing, stoplight blocks are all individual mechanics. The dynamics are displayed on screen, and the aesthetics are the feeling that you get from them.
Yeah.
MDA in 1 minute.
What is your name?
Carrie?
Hello, I am Luke.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Carrie.
Everything inside of Celeste, it's not necessarily that the mechanics are separate, because all of the mechanics inside of the game are there in order to preserve the one thing that, or I guess technically there's the climbing, but the main thing that separates Celeste from other platformers, which is the dash, because like everything either resets the dash or means that you don't have to be using your dash in order to get to a location, which is, if you went like, yeah, that's at least how I kind of view it.
Celeste definitely centers around the dash, and I think the game focuses a lot on just grabbing onto things. Like in this example, they do that a lot. And if they make you climb, they only ever make you do it like a little bit, except for in the B-sides. If you climb too much, you will be unable to climb. You'll start falling. And they actually use that as a challenge. You have to kind of ration your stamina bar, essentially, to complete levels in the B-sides.
I think they take away your dash in it, like.
Not in the B-sides.
Oh, I'm thinking about there's like, after you finish all of that, get all the gems and stuff, or not gems, but discs. There's like a final one, or final like stage thing where it's like lava and ice, where it's like they limit your dash after giving you double dashing, where it's like you have to get to a certain point before it resets, and then that kind of creates a new type of like feeling within the game of. I'm not fully sure because I've only watched other people play it, but it seems like it makes it more dynamic, I guess? Not dynamic, but like the way that the levels are constructed are around the fact that you can't do stuff, and it's both the fact that you have the dash and the way that they design the levels that then everything like comes together in general.
Yeah. I think one of the big things about empowerment is that it centers around the idea that you are imposing artificial restrictions on the player and then lifting them. The inherent restrictions in Celeste are that you can jump like 2 feet and you get 1 dash and you can only climb so high. And all of the rest of the mechanics in the game fix that. They, the clouds, they allow you to jump higher. They remove that restriction that jumping originally had. Or the crystals give you another dash. And that's a lot of what the gameplay kind of centers around, is the imposing of restrictions and then lifting them. And I think that that's a lot of how empowerment plays out in games. We create restrictions. We pick essentially what the main challenge or 2 of the game is going to be. And we spend the rest of the game making that challenge harder and also giving the player more ways to overcome the challenge. Think about like a turn-based RPG. The inherent challenge is that you're managing your health, you're managing your mana, you're managing your abilities, and you have to defeat the enemies who also have health and abilities. And they make these enemies harder, they give them more complex abilities, but at the same time they give you more abilities, higher health and mana bars. All these artificial restrictions and rules that the game puts in place, they spend the rest of the time removing. Because yeah, I think a lot of game design in general just centers around designing the system of your game as a whole with an inherent challenge and then numerous ways of overcoming that challenge. A lot of games, I feel, end up doing that. And then the more the player gets familiar with the core mechanics, in the case of Celeste, jumping, climbing, and dashing, the more other side mechanics that they add. Last quarter I did a workshop on Shovel Knight, another platformer, similar in that there's jumping, and then the 2 mechanics that Shovel Knight adds on is that you can dig with your shovel and you can bounce on things with your shovel. And the entire game builds on those same mechanics. Same exact idea, different areas add other level-specific mechanics. And at the very end, there's a level that combines all of those mechanics together. seems to be a common type of structure, if not within games as a whole, at least within pixel platformers. But yeah, in Shovel Knight, the same kind of restrictions apply, and then they give you different ways, different challenges to overcome, and different ways to overcome the challenges. And I think that that's kind of one of the most practical takeaways from the workshop is kind of finding. A lot of times in the club we'll use the term "find the fun in your game," and I think that what that really boils down to is finding what makes your game challenging and what are the ways players like to overcome that challenge. So yeah, seems like the discussion is kind of losing steam, but is there anything else anyone would like to say before we kind of wrap up? Final thoughts? All right. Well, thank you guys for coming and talking about Celeste with me. Do we have any idea what next week's design workshop is?
I'm not teaching it.
I'm not either.
No, I can't remember. There's a PDF somewhere.
But there will be one.
Yeah.
There will be a design workshop. No one knows what it's on, not even us.
It's a mystery to all.
Yeah, so you'll have to show up to find out. Yeah.
This should be pretty good. I think Sean's teaching it.
If Sean's teaching it, you're fine.
Yeah, it sounds super familiar.
That concludes the workshop. So thank you guys.